Legacy is still in a broken state. Even post-ban, the combo decks or the I win buttons aren't completely gone. And with that in mind, I wanted to use this video to provide a brief reintroduction into Legacy Painter. Take a look at an exploratory factor as to what type of archetypes in Painter are seeping their way to the top, in terms of mono red being the most common one, but mono blue also making its way there with the combination of Painter Servant and Grindstone having that I win button in these kind of mid-range combo, whatever type of strategies you have. Painter not only feeds the combo aspect for players, but also feeds the mid-range players and giving them an I win button. But also for all my mill players out there on the channel, Painter is just such a fun archetype. And in the background right now is just one of my gameplay videos of past. I stepped away from the archetype to explore other formats, but now I'm looking back at Legacy with the format still broken, with a lot of the combo decks still at the top and no one touching oops, but some level of blue-based strategy coming back and Force of Will returning in terms of more, I guess, powerful viability and what it can stop. Is the Legacy metagame ready to handle something like Painter, and is it low-key just one of the top 3 decks in the format? As a relative Legacy newbie, I've come in at a time where I feel like it's a rather easy time to learn the format, but a very frustrating time to really get enfranchised with it. And I understand this from many Legacy creators talking about how fast the format is and how much it's put a lot of age-old archetypes to the back burner. And I'm promise you all of this is going to lead into Painter, but you have to get a framework to understand where Painter is right now and why it is that good. And so when it comes down to combo and hyper fast I win buttons through the mid-range decks, why is it that you need insta wins in a format with Force of Will and free spells, and where the status quo is be able to answer at any time, and being tapped out doesn't mean you're out of the game? Well, with Modern Horizons 3, you have to understand that a deck like Oops All Spells actually gained more untapped modal double face cards. It gained more untapped lands, and that honestly was surprising. I shouldn't say surprisingly, but I guess less surprisingly so, the piece that put it over the edge in terms of how fast the deck can be. Being able to consistently win on turn 1 actually isn't so much a thing in Legacy. Like, yes, turn 1 wins exist and turn 0 wins, I guess, are a thing as well. But being able to consistently do it is a whole other part of the problem. And ideally, Force of Will is around to stop that. And what happened pre-ban in Legacy was you would have the Eldrazi decks that did a pretty good job of holding the blue decks back, and then Oops All Spells being ideally stopped by the blue decks, where that was then able to just be at the top of the metagame and just be the best deck. But of course, the best deck also ended up just being a blue deck anyway. Oops All Spells was like the about 3rd or 4th best decks, because Red Stompy was still really good, being able to answer the Eldrazi decks and just having a good mid-range plan, but also, to be fair, was abusing the One Ring. But the best deck was still a blue deck, being able to use Force of Will, but also have an I win button in the reanimation strategy. And we kind of still see that when it comes to Dimir Temple. Ultimately, you still need combo in this metagame. And when I say ultimately, I mean post-ban, not a lot has changed. We look at the Legacy bans that happened on March 31st, Sowing Michael Spawn ban and Troll of Khazad-dûm. So the idea was that you take something out of the Reanimator decks and you take something out of the Eldrazi decks. Now, if you look at the reasoning for this, really the portion that you want to focus on here is this bit. So by the numbers, the Legacy of today does a good job of emulating a balanced format. We're going to touch on that in a second. Most played decks and all that stuff. The issue is that despite having several different decks, the format's slower macro archetypes like mid-range and control, the blue-based strategies, have largely been pushed out of the metagame as environmental pressures have widely condensed the games. Further, player sentiment and event attendance has trended downward. It's apparent to us that people who love to play Legacy do not love to play today's Legacy. So we're taking a couple steps to try and improve that format. And so when it comes to that, you then take a second look at what this metagame is. And so you honestly see a relatively wide spread in the sense of, 12%, 8%, almost 8, 7%, 6%. Honestly, a wide variety of decks are actually being represented. And so that's why, by the numbers, you have a diverse metagame. It's not like in Modern where energy is like almost 20% of the metagame. But when it comes to actually gameplay, you have to take in player sentiment into mind, because you also have to remember that Legacy being an eternal format that takes into mind the reserve list, you have to understand that Wizards of the Coast is not making a Pro Tour Legacy. And so player tournaments, in-person tournaments, and just player sentiment overall by its most enfranchised players are a very overwhelmingly valid opinion in terms of the things you have to pay attention to as to who likes to play Legacy. Now, whether or not that's a good or bad thing is a long-term discussion. I think Legacy has some growing pains that it's had for over years, and a lot of people have talked about, you know, good gameplay versus not. Eventually, you know, I think we all understand that as enfranchised Magic players, like, power creep, quote unquote, has to happen. Cards have to get better over time. I'm not saying Orcish Bowmasters was like a necessary thing, but at some point down the line, I do believe if the game went on for hundreds of years, Orcish Bowmasters naturally would have been printed at some point anyway. We just kind of skipped the line and it's here now. And so when it comes to cards that change the status quo, it's important to understand where Legacy can adapt to this. And this is where I feel like a deck list like Painter can really do that, being that mid-range type of strategy that actually has an I win button and has that attraction for many mill players out there. It's a really cool deck in terms of being mono red, red white, mono blue. Those tend to be like the more common archetypes, although I will give a shout out to colorless Painter as well, that also has its merit. To my knowledge, ends up being a little bit slower, and honestly had a lot more merit in the Vexing Bauble era of things. But when it comes to like the current era of Legacy, I'm not sure if you really want to be playing Karn the Great Creator I don't know, what are you stopping with Karn the Great Creator? I feel like that's one of the bigger attractions to colorless Painter. For now, we look at the baseline red Painter. This specifically came second place in a recent Legacy challenge here. And the idea is that it comes down to that basic combo, right? So you have the where's the Painter? The Painter Servant right there, and the Grindstone right there. As mentioned in the intro, the most busted opener that you can have is essentially double Ancient Tomb. So you play Ancient Tomb on 1 and you pay 2 for the Painter. And then what you do is on turn 2, you play at another Ancient Tomb. You have access to 4 mana. You pay 1 for the Grindstone and then 3 to activate it. And so that's your fastest, most broken opener. Of course, it may not be, I shouldn't say, like that's the fastest, most kind of basic broken intro. Obviously you could go like you could go Ancient Tomb into petal, like there's stuff like that going on. But more realistically, you're probably going like Ancient Tomb into Exile Simian Spirit Guide, and then playing out like a Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, or playing out like a Blood Moon if you're playing it, or a Magus of the Moon if you're playing it main board. Heck, even game 2 you could be doing something like that. And so you have a lot of these mid-range pieces that you're generally going for. And so some of the more disruptive lines that you can get into is stuff like Chaos Defiler. When it enters the battlefield or dies, for each opponent, in this case it would just be 1, choose a non-land permanent that player controls, destroy 1 of them at random. Now in Commander, Chaos Defiler would be choose 3 permanents and then you destroy 1 of them at random. When it comes to Constructed, it's just choose 1 permanent, destroy that permanent at random. You're just destroying it. And so Chaos Defiler has an ability to destroy something on death and on enter. So when it comes to something like Goblin Welder that can swap the places of certain artifacts, you sacrifice that artifact, it leaves, comes back in. You can get into some crazy loops when it comes to maybe not like loops per se, but crazy situations where you're able to deal with multiple permanents at the same time, noting that it is non-land. The way you get this in your graveyard to reanimate is something like Goblin Engineer, and it ends up being one of the main engine pieces in this deck to be able to tutor up an artifact, put it into your graveyard, and then get it back. You also have like classic one-ofs like Phyrexian Dragon Engine. This is one of my personal favorite cards. After learning this deck, this is just genuinely one of my personal favorite cards to come out of Legacy. The card is just so cool. Comes out of just like a very underexplored set overall, and you're able to unearth it for 3. It's a double striker with haste. If you do unearth it, you do get the random like meld bit. Some people do play that little bit as a meme, but for now, when it enters, you discard your hand and draw 3. So especially if you're empty, this is just a great target to be able to kind of keep going and get like a weird build your own draw 3. And then really the big attraction to this is that generally speaking, when it comes to playing Painter's Servant, you're going to be naming blue so that all cards that aren't in play and whatnot are blue. And so then you're going to be able to destroy them with Red Elemental Blast and also counter those spells with Red Elemental Blast. So you're playing 4 Pyroblast, 4 Red Elemental Blast in the main board, and you're going to be able to counter anything and everything ideally. So you can even just play Painter. So you can go turn 1 Ancient Tomb, play a Painter, play a Lotus Petal, and then hold up a counterspell for almost anything at that point if you had one of these up. Some of these decks are very different in terms of how they're constructed, in terms of how fast they want to be. Right now, this version is specifically playing 3 Lightning Bolts. I would probably tend to be, I would tend to a list closer to this. I am a big fan of Lightning Bolt. I like the reach that it has. I think there's a lot of merit to it as well. So when it comes to something like this, I really like what this deck list can do in terms of speed, especially when it comes to something like Arena of Glory. You can get off to some crazy lines when it comes to Arena of Glory and playing out a Goblin Engineer and immediately getting off, like getting it off, or maybe with something like a Fury. Heck, if, you know, Fable the Mirror Breaker can copy Fury in the later game to like kill some like bigger things and whatnot. So there's a lot of merit to your Artifact Tutor package alongside Urza Saga to be able to get off like one of like Soul Guide Lantern for Graveyard Hate, classic pack. Parts like Lava Spur Boots. I personally do like the Shadow Spear in here as well. Sometimes I'll play it, sometimes I won't, but I do like Shadow Spear in here for a little bit of like trampling over top. I find that if you're going for that mid-range attack plan, having that type of evasion is important when it comes to those decks where that matters. Like a lot of times, like if you're battling with creatures, the trample is big. If you're not battling with creatures, then like whatever, it doesn't matter. I just like having that piece. Lava Spur Boots is just great because it's just going to give your Saga tokens haste. So you can, in an ideal world, you know, you get your Urza Saga, you create a second artifact, a second construct, I should say, on your third Saga trigger, and then the first one that you created on your second Saga trigger will already be able to attack that turn, but now the third one, the second one I should say, will be able to come in with something like a Lava Spur Boots and get in as well with a little bit of protection. So something like a Lava Spur Boots is great for that. So all in all, it's ideally a red mid-range strategy. Painter is a red mid-range grindy strategy that ultimately has an I win button out of nowhere, which is why a lot of legacy players have to respect it. You have to respect the power of Painter because it can almost win out of nowhere, right? You just have a bunch of cards in hand. You don't know what those cards are. All of a sudden they go Painter, Grindstone, and they just win the game through the activation. Now, obviously, you can't just rip it against all decks. You have to remember a card like Stifle is legal in this format, in a format where Stifle Knot, Azorius Stifle Knot is a legitimate strategy that technically has a quote unquote like I win button enabled to play like a 1-mana 12/12. So when it comes to Stifle Knot, sometimes like players are just going to have effects that they can use in response to the activation. So you have to remember, just because you activate doesn't mean you win, because players can destroy the Painter Servant in response to the activation. So you have to be very careful of when you're doing that. But you can do some tricky things where you can play out the Grindstone. You know, activate Grindstone for 3. Then if you don't have the Painter, in response to the activation, you can actually activate the Goblin Engineer to sacrifice the Grindstone to put a Painter Servant from your graveyard into play. And then everything is blue, or whatever color you choose. If you have like red elemental blast and stuff, you choose everything is blue, and then you just kind of attack in that way. So there's a lot of angles that you get out of Painter in Legacy. But one reason that I shouldn't say one reason, the main reason I wanted to make this video is a more recent exploration and increase and uptick in blue-based Painter. Again, the types of Painter that you're really looking at are mono red, red and white, a mono blue, and then sometimes colorless as well. There are versions of Painter everywhere. These are the more popular versions of them. And when it comes to blue-based Painter, there are elements of this that many modern players can kind of draw some similarities to. So you kind of have like the Emery and Tamiyo package, and that comes with, you know, kind of a couple of Mox Opals and stuff and Lotus Petals. So you're not necessarily playing Mox Ambers. You like the Lotus Petal because it's an instant piece of mana of any color that's not restricted by having a legendary out, but also it hits the graveyard. So having that artifact hit the graveyard and being able to swap it out with certain pieces are great in the red-based strategies. But Lotus Petal ultimately at the end of the day, just being free mana with no restriction early on turn 1, there's just nothing to beat when it comes to that. So you're playing the Emery package to be able to mill yourself, costing 1 less for each kind of artifact that you have out. Tamiyo just being able to create other artifacts for you to use as well. Really what this deck is looking to do is make a poor impression of 8-cast. So 8-cast is just a legacy archetype that uses 4 casts, so Thought Monitor and Thought Cast. And so when it comes to these artifacts that generally cost 1 to draw 2 cards based on the amount of artifacts that you have out, technically it is a modern strategy at this point now with Kappa Cannoneer being in the modern format, but generally speaking, it does a poor job of like imitating 8-cast, but it has the benefit of being able to have that protection with it. So you're a blue-based strategy, you're playing Force of Will, you're playing some level of Force Negation. This version isn't playing Daze. I don't think generally you're playing Daze either, to be fair, because a lot of your lands like don't kind of bounce back for the Daze. You have to think of cards like Ancient Tomb and Urza Saga that generally don't bounce back, and you're playing Seed of Sign out for a little bit of artifact shenanigans along with the Thoughtcast. But you do gain access to the relatively new stock up that's been taking a lot of constructed formats by storm. So you get some amount of digging, and you still get a lot of like fast interactive pieces. And so your Goblin Engineer kind of analog ends up being like Emery Lurker of the Lock, which is perfectly fine. You just lose a lot of the mid-range power that the red-based strategies have. So it's really about what you are looking to do to attack the legacy metagame right now. If you're opting for the power of what Force of Will has, then Force of Will can speak for itself. You're going to be able to dig. You're going to have a lot of powerful artifact strategies, a lot of artifact synergies, but you also gain a different angle of artifact synergies when it comes to the mono red versions. Now, I personally prefer the mono red versions, but let me know in the comment section down below. Do you want to see some gameplay on mono blue Painter, an archetype that I haven't really explored, but I think there's merit to? You get a lot of fun stuff out of the sideboard, you know, some blue elemental blast, consign, hydroblast, whatever. You get more counter magic in the Force of Negations. Fairy Macabre is going to be very important in a format, not only where you're going to have Force of Will to counter the Oops All Spells decks and graveyard strategies, but Fairy Macabre is just going to be that extra uncounterable aspect to it. Although the Oops All Spells deck, unfortunately, does have actually relatively good ways to get around the Fairy Macabre, although it does extend their clock and puts you on the back burner. Ashen Rider is actually an interesting one here. This is primarily for the Omnitel decks. So, the Show and Tell decks are actually back in full force, and they are a blue-based strategy with an I win button. And so generally what they're looking to do is Show and Tell out an Omniscience. That's why they're called Omnitel. And so Ashen Rider is then going to be able to enter the battlefield with that and destroy the Omniscience. Now, they can obviously do like funky things, like if they expect the Ashen Rider, then they can Show and Tell out in Emrakul. They can just get that out straight. But obviously that's not ideal, because then, you know, you're not casting it, you're not be able to attack with it, and then you're just going to have to pass back to the Painter player, generally speaking, to be able to give them another turn to be able to set up and find some type of answer, whatever. Like, they're still going to be able to find a way, quote unquote, around stuff like this. And so that is where things like this can be very tricky, and you have to be very careful with how you're using Ashen Rider. But generally speaking, if you're able to win the game one, your opponent doesn't expect the Ashen Rider. That's what it's going to come down to. Now, that is my general exploration of Painter currently in the legacy metagame. I am hoping to post some Painter gameplay soon, and I'm actually looking at posting both mono red and mono blue. But of course, if y'all aren't looking for that mono blue, if you just want to see that red or red white type of Painter, I have to re-explore the One Ring. I know pre-ban, the One Ring was a great conversation in and amongst like the Painter Discord. A lot of people had a lot of success with it. They really liked it. I personally did. There's just a lot of problems with it when you came like, so specifically the One Ring is a really powerful artifact, we all know, and it's used in Legacy a lot in the mono red decks. But specifically when it comes to something like Goblin Engineer, generally you're limited by the fact that Goblin Engineer can reanimate or bring back an artifact with a converted mana cost of 3 or less. That's why you're looking at something that's why you're looking at stuff like Ensnaring Bridge, which is a great piece against the Omnitel decks. You're looking at Phyrexian Dragon Engine, which is 3. And so generally these are the type of things that you're able to bring back, whereas the One Ring are not, but you can kind of bring it back with like a Goblin Welder if you need to, which is why, yeah, you play the Chaos Defiler, because it's just like a crazy interactive piece. It's a 5/4 with Trample. I mean, it just attacks really well as well. So there's a lot of things that you do get value out of, but it just has to be overwhelming. So a lot of times when people play the One Ring, you're playing like 4. Generally, it's not a tutor target because you just don't get that value out of Goblin Engineer. If you did, it would probably be banned at this point. But regardless, when it comes to stopping those type of strategies, you really want to make sure that the cards you're putting in here you can tutor, or you have it as a play set so you can draw. But that's my little aside about the One Ring. Let me know what you think about Painter combo in the Legacy format, and let me know if you want to see gameplay of it here on the channel. I've had it on the channel before. I've kind of stepped away from it, just exploring a lot more of Modern and my more recent interests of 2. Actually, I just want to kind of take the curtain away here. I have been playing a lot more 5-land Spy, and I've actually been looking into and exploring gameplay of Kethis combo. I wanted to explore combo decks in general. I've been really getting a love for them over the past year. Kethis combo looks like a fun little, like, much harder to play, much worse version of like Underworld Breach that recently got banned. So I'm definitely going to be looking at that. Let me know if you want to see gameplay of that on the channel. But regardless, that is where Painter is at in the Legacy metagame. And it's a broken time still.